Well, my topic is corpus linguistics in medical and psychiatric research, right? Essentially, the motivation was try to broadening the scope of corpus linguistics, looking for new challenges, and particularly in the fields of medicine, psychiatry, and clinical linguistics. So the goal was to use all these corpus-based techniques and corpora in order to find not just linguistic patterns for linguistic analysis, grammar, syntax, lexicography, whatever, but looking for evidence about cognitive pathologies. I'm going to concentrate on two case studies. One of the case study is Edgar Allan Poe and his bipolar mental disorder. And the other case study is Harold Wilson and his alleged Alzheimer's disease. Let's start with Edgar Allan Poe. Well, Edgar Allan Poe seems to have suffered by some bipolar disorder or manic depression disorder. Well, basically, essentially, it's a mood disorder that shifts from euphoria to depression. It's not just an up and down, it's something very severe. It starts with depressive conditions, which is a persistent low mood, low esteem, and also loss of interest, even in those activities which normally anyone really would enjoy. And the other extreme is hypomania, that is the more positive mood, that is some kind of euphoria or something that generates a very high degree of energy. And normally hypomania or euphoria is related or favors creativity. Of course, there is some kind of evidence, according to the biographies of Edgar Allan Poe, that he suffers some kind of mental disorder. But of course, I mean, due to the advances in medicine and psychiatry, there is no actual diagnosis that he actually suffered this mental illness. According to some biographies by Mabbott or Pickover, there are some characteristics which are very close to what is now known as bipolar disorder. Okay, now our starting assumption is that the language of any individual reveals his inner world. So in a way, it's indirectly, it gives the idea about how his brain or her brain processes information. So our idea was, what about if we scrutinize Poe's literary production? Now, this might give us some clues about the information. That is, let's look at his cyclothemia, that is his changes of mood, and see if this is how reflected in his literary creativity. So our hypothesis was this. So we hypothesized that post-cyclonemic disorders that fluctuate from euphoria to depression, are somehow reflected in his production, particularly in the lexical change along his tales. So we are going to try to look for evidences in his lexical selection. Now, the methodology is the longitudinal analysis. So we are going to make repeated measures over time. And we were confident that this would give us some valuable insights about two things, particularly to see if there is any episodic mood fluctuations from euphoria to depression, and also to figure out where any potential variable best evidence these fluctuations. The methodology was the following. We selected 42 out of his total of 69 tales. We selected 42 and we discarded a number of tales because some of the tales were sort of auto-plagiarism or copies, partial copies of others, which was a strategy very common in Poe when he was short of money, so he just copied fractions of or bits of different tales and came up with a new tale. So we discarded all these tales, which were sort of not original tales, and we just stick to 42. That means approximately 61% of the whole tale production that ranges from 1831 to 1849. And these 61% is highly representative, which is covers nearly the whole variability of his lexical choice. Okay, these are the tales we selected. The tales are ordered chronologically, not necessarily chronologically with the date of publication, but the date of creation or writing. Okay, so you have, for instance, that in 1831, the first one is the decided loss, the second one, the Tale of Jerusalem. So they are ordered or chronologically. The variable we used were essentially those commonly used in corpus-based techniques or methodologies or research, and we stratified them in 3 categories. The 8 variables or measures are categorized in lexical richness, which is essentially the standardized type token ratio as 𝗬𝗏 and Bayern used. Also the ratio of content words. Now we understand as content words nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs. Then the second group of measures were lexical features of the mental lexicon, where we have the mean word length, where we have long words, that is words longer than 10 characters or roughly 3 syllables. Then 𝗵𝗄 legomena, words with a single occurrence, and exclusive 𝗵𝗄 legomena. The difference is that exclusive 𝗵𝗄 legomena are words that are only used in one specific tale. They don't appear in other tales. Whereas 𝗵𝗄 legomena are simply words with a frequency of 1 in each individual novels. And finally, the lexicosemantic text difficulty, which is measured by means of the mean sentence length in words, measured in words, and also the automated readability index, which gives you an idea about the text reading difficulty of each tale. Okay, so the last 2 ones are less lexicosemantic. They're also somehow related to the syntax of the different tales. So are they difficult to read? Are the sentences complex or not? Okay. Now our focus was the following. Once we got all these 8 measures for each of the tales, we normalized the data and we transformed them into z-scores. And our interests were actually the 2 extremes. That is, those measures which were above 2 standard deviations or below 2 standard deviation. Now all the rest, the 95% of the rest of the range of the measures were considered normal for Poe. So what we did, we tried to measure the normality of Poe, and we just focus on the extreme, what is abnormal or non-normal in Poe, which is of course not the same for each author. So what is not normal for Poe is not necessarily not normal for any other author particularly. So we try to figure out the normality of Poe and focus on the non-normal behavior of the lexical features in Poe. And this is essentially what we did. These are the different measures. So this is the standardized type token ratio. So this is sort of our line, 2 standard deviations above, 2 standard deviations below. So whatever surpasses these 2 standard deviations is considered not normal, even in Poe. So you see, for instance, that in 1839 in the 𝗵𝗄 yeah, which is here in 39 here, you see a very abnormal behavior with regarding type token ratio, which means that it has a very, very low type token ratio. So it means a very low lexical choice, right? Whereas here, this one here. Whereas here, for instance, you have a very low one, which is this one here, why the little Frenchman, sorry. This is clearly a very poor lexical choice, which means very, very few types compared to here, okay, or lexically rich. The next measure was the content word ratio, that is the ratio of content words such as nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs, right? So all these abnormal measures were found in 1841 in the descent in Nostrum and towards the end of the period, right? And these are the difference. Mean word length, that is, okay, so we have here, for instance, an overuse of very short words, an overuse of very long words compared to his normal lexical choice or lexical behavior, right? Also sentence length, okay, we have here very short sentences compared with this period, very long sentences, and you see very important fluctuations toward the end of his life. So here, very short sentences, very long, short, long, and so on, right? Long words, use of long words, actually it's just affected at the very beginning where he has an overuse of very long words, right? And here occasionally the underuse of long words, that is words with more than 10 syllables. The automatic readability index here is related with the complexity of reading the tales. So you can see that this tale here is relatively very easy to read compared with this one here, right? And these fluctuations become more acute towards the ends, where we have very easy readable tales compared to very difficult ones or more complex ones, right? And this is a constant fluctuation. Okay, with regards to 𝗵𝗂𝗃𝗃, we see a very abnormal behavior, right? So overuse of very rare words, because 𝗵𝗂𝗃𝗃 just occur once, so they're supposed to be rare words, and also exclusive 𝗵𝗂𝗃𝗃, right? If we put all this information together, right, we see here the green one, sort of normal periods of Poe. So nothing strange happens here, which is roughly around mid-1831 to approximately towards the end of 35. You can here see a minor period of important fluctuations. However, we can really evidence 4 very strongly marked periods with very high fluctuations, which is this one here, which is late 38, beginning 39, late 39 towards approximately the end of 41, then mid 42 towards the beginning of 31, and very acute towards the end, late 46 towards his suicide in 49. Okay, now graphically, these are the mood, the prominent mood fluctuations, right, which can be evidenced here in 4 very distinct periods, right? Well, the problem now was how to match this and how to correlate this with his life. Well, I'm not an expert in literature, I'm not an expert in Poe. So I went to a conference, a very specific conference, which was the European Conference on Poe, and I met the president of the European Association of Edgar Allan Poe. And he recently wrote a book on his biography, on Poe's biography. Now, before I asked him about what I was doing and told him what I was doing, I just asked him sort of very informally, could you just please summarize in very short paragraphs the most prominent periods of Poe where he suffered most or where he was most successful? And this was what he gave me. He gave me 4 periods. He gave me the first period that goes from 38 towards early 39, where Poe and his family moved to Philadelphia. That's just the year before New York. He had very much worries about his family, and that's also the year where he married, right? And previously, well, very close to his marriage, right? So there were constant fluctuations from depression and euphoria. This matches exactly with the period we evidenced here, which is period 1. The second one was 39 towards more or less mid-41. In 39, he published a book with some successful success, which was his poems, The Raven. And euphoria was more prevalent here, with some depression period. Then mid-42 towards early 43, when he left Graham's magazine, he was sacked because of his inconstancy and also his little appearance in work, right, which is mostly depressive. And then the last period that goes from mid-46 to 49, his wife died in 47, and he had great doubts, and it was also a very depressive state also when he committed suicide, right? Now, from a more linguistic point of view, we can interpret the different periods as the first period. There are some abnormalities that concentrate specifically in lexical choice and syntax. When I refer to syntax, it's a very loose concept here. It refers actually to the syntactic complexity, that is, long sentences or short sentences, and easy to read or difficult to read, right? The second period is a very varied period, so there is actually no pattern. There's constant changes, right, from syntax, vocabulary. A very interesting period is the third period, where you can see here two periods which are somehow mutually exclusive. You find the first period that goes from mid-42 towards the end of 42, where most of the changes are related with rare words, that is, with lexical choice, choosing lexical rare words. These rare words are mostly related to places, names, or also very, very terms which were really selective by means of dictionary or sources, which are very rare words, hardly used in normal conversation or whatever. And there is a second period that goes towards the end of 42 to the beginning of 43, in which it's much more concentrated on lexical choice, that is the type-token ratio, the mean length, and long and short words. And probably the most prominent period is the fourth period, where you can see constant fluctuations, particularly in the syntactic part, which here you can see texts which are relatively very easy to read, very difficult, very easy, very difficult, and very easy again. So you can see here the constant fluctuation, right? So if we go back to the starting hypothesis, where we say that post-cyclothemic disorders that fluctuated from euphoria to depression, that they were reflected in the lexical change or choice. So we could, with some confidence, actually reject the null hypothesis, right? And we could say that these very standard and very basic lexical measures we have used, which are sort of low-cost measures, have really evidenced four clearly distinct periods with which somehow correlate with his adventurous life, right? And of course, I mean, this is a very promising research line, so we could try to validate this research either using more production by Poe, but also compare it with other apparently sane or mentally disturbed authors, which were contemporary of Poe, right? Okay, some references. If you're interested, just write me. I will send you all these references and all these lists, right? Now, the second case study I'm going to focus now is the case study of Harold Wilson and his apparent, because it wasn't actually proved scientifically and medically, Alzheimer's disease, right? Okay, well, Alzheimer's disease is, as everybody knows, a very progressive and it's an irreversible decline of a range of cognitive abilities. Now, as the disease progresses, the nerve cells shrink and die, and also the brain itself shrinks and the surface wrinkles and becomes smoother. So if you see sort of a snapshot of the brain, you can see a healthy brain and an Alzheimer affected brain. So it's really dramatic, and it's absolutely devastating and irreversible illness or disease. Well, the early symptoms of Alzheimer are sort of very minor memory loss and minor forgetfulness. Okay, somebody says, "Oh, I can't find my car's keys," so but don't worry, it's not a clear sign, but it's sort of these early symptoms, right? So minor forgetfulness or memory loss. Okay, now these symptoms become steadily more dense when the illness starts progressing, right? And the problem with Alzheimer's disease is that the preclinical stage is very difficult to diagnose because there are no reliable or valid symptoms that could give you an early diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. Okay, now there have been numerous studies about Alzheimer's disease in language, and the only common thing I've found in everything I've read so far is that language is very vulnerable at the early stages of Alzheimer's. So which means that you could probably detect Alzheimer by analyzing the language, which is in some cases even far more reliable than the mini-mental test, which is sort of the standard test that is normally used in this case. Right? The number of case studies, particularly by Peter Garrett, which is, this work is inspired by him, right? And I'm going to, it's partially a replication of one of his studies, but it's very motivating, sort of very illustrating, right? And there was another one by Lancashire and Hurst, which vocabulary changes in Agatha Christie, right? But I'm not very sure about this because he actually used Agatha Christie's last novel to figure out whether there was some deterioration in his mental state. But just reminds you that her last novel was written with 94 years. So I would be proud and happy to write a novel with 94 years, even if I was happens to be mentally disturbed or whatever. Okay, so the goal here is try to identify linguistic variables that are likely to be altered due to Alzheimer's affection at the embryonic stage, that is at the early stages, right? And the case study here is the former British Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. Okay, the methodology is quite similar to the one followed by with the 𝗟𝗏𝗄𝗏. It's a longitudinal study. What I did here was I contrasted the 10 years at office of Harold Wilson. It goes from 1964 to 1960, and the last period from 72 to 76. So 64 is the first year in office of Harold Wilson, and 76 is his last year when he finally resigned. So apparently, there should be some signs of potential Alzheimer's disease, okay, or mild cognitive impairment. Okay. Now, the data we collected here was the oral outcomes of Harold Wilson. So we resorted to the Hansard corpus. The Hansard corpus is essentially a transcript of all the spoken material in the two houses of Parliament. It derives very, very little from actually the real verbatim. So there are very few deletions, and which normally affect sort of repetition of words or some fillers or insults, right? But there are very few corrections. So it sticks very much to what actually the MP members say at Parliament. Okay. So what we did is we compared these 10 periods that go from 64 to 76, right? And we selected randomly 25 tokens for each period. Okay. We tried to stick to spontaneous speech. So what we did is we deleted statements, so statements which were read aloud, and we just stick to his oral production or verbal exchanges. Okay. As for the variables, now the difference here is that we didn't use standard corpus variables or those variables which are normally used in the corpus linguistics literature. What we did here instead was to make a thorough revision of which variables were used in preclinical Alzheimer's detection. There is no conclusive studies, as there's nothing that says that these are the variables that should be analyzed. So it was very difficult to determine which variables to use, which variables to discard. So the easiest thing was we used them all. So we used all the variables that have been used so far to evidence mild cognitive impairment in language by people affected or supposedly affected for variables. So we have different typologies. We used punctuation variables, we used lexical distribution measures, we used the 30 most common words, we used the 30 most common content words used by Harold Wilson, by our case study. We also used date markers, person and place markers. This was very difficult to do because we had to mark them or to tag them manually, right? We also used typologies of nouns, also the ratio of nouns versus pronouns, parts of speech distribution, not just in in types, but also in hapax legomena, also syntactic complexity by means of conjunctions, and repetition of word phrases, that is hapax legomena and n-grams, that goes from 2 to 12 words. And also the use of indefinite words, indefinite pronouns such as somebody, anyone, everybody, everything, and so on and so forth. Right? I'm just going to concentrate on those features which revealed statistically significant. Right? As for the punctuation variables, we found three significant differences. We found a significant difference in the use of semicolons. Semicolons started to be underused towards the end of Harold Wilson's stay at office, right? This was also similar in the use of colons, and also, or nearly significant in the case of question marks. In the case of question marks, we were quite surprised, so we did something further, which was to analyze the typology of questions used by Harold Wilson, 64, first year at office, and his last year. And what we found was not just a minor use of questions, but also a minor typology or variability of types of questions, whereas in 64, he resorted essentially on yes-no questions and also WH questions, but also interrogative alternatives, tags, and other types of interrogatives. In 76, he used essentially only 2 types of questions, which are the relative questions, WH questions, and absolute questions, yes-no questions. So we found that there was a statistically significant differences, not in the use of questions, but in the typology of questions used. As for the lexical distribution measures, the 30 most frequent words, what we found was an extreme difference and overuse of the pronoun you. The pronoun you, we analyzed all instances of the pronoun you found in the different texts, and we found that here pronoun you refers to second person singular, not the plural, just singular. Okay. As for personal deixis, we found an overuse again. We found an overuse of you, third person, second person singular, and my, the possessive my, and clearly an underuse, nearly disappearance of we, us, and our, and rarely any instance for third person pronouns. As for place deixis, we found an overuse of adverbs such as ahead, forward, here, outside, there, together, and a clear underuse of opposite. Okay. As for typologies of nouns, we found an overuse of nouns indicating directions in singular, common nouns neutral for number, and temporal nouns in singular. As for content words, there is an overuse of friend, member, sir, matter, country, party, aware. I come to this in a second. Okay. As for conjunctions, there is an overuse of nor, although, as though, so, that, then, and why. And there is a complete absence of whether. And I say complete absence of whether because whether was his most used conjunction in the first years of office. So it just disappears towards the end of his stay at office, right? And the very striking finding was the n-gram repetitions, that is, the use of different n-grams. You can see here very clearly that the use of 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, even 8 n-grams was very similar along the different years. There is a change in 75 where he started using 10 words n-grams. But most strikingly, in 76, he started using 12 word n-grams repeatedly. And this is very striking. Okay, so you can hear the frequency of the different distributions. You can find here sort of a very homogeneous behavior. And this behavior starts to deviate here, particularly here, where we find n-grams of 2 words, 12 words, 11, 10, which never occurred before. Okay, so the preliminary conclusions we can find is that there seem to be some significant changes in a number of linguistic variables. which could be a sign of some presence of neurological changes in Harold Wilson, particularly towards the end. Okay, now these possible changes, could be probably related to the organization and structuring of his mental lexicon. Recall that he started to use there is a higher usage of engrams or fixed structures, particularly of 2 to 8 words. And what is striking is he started using for the first time occurrences of structures, very long structures, from 9 words onwards towards 12 words. Okay. There's also a very significant usage increase of some words such as you, and also some hyponym-like nouns like friend, member, matter, sir, and country. And this is very revealing. I don't know if you know something about Harold Wilson, but he had a formidable memory. He could quote the classics. He was able he knew everybody in the parliament. He could actually address to anyone with his name. Towards the end, he's unable to address people by their name. Instead, he used friend or member. Also, when he referred to countries, he was no more able to name the country's name. He said just country. And even some issues, he just related to them as matter. He was not able to precisely refer to them with their specific name or term, right? With regarding lexical grammar, there also seems to be a less lexical and grammatical complexity. There is this, as just mentioned, the less lexical precision. There is an overuse of hyponyms. There's also an overuse of some conjunctions and syntactic structures, right? So coordinated clauses, particularly an overuse of the coordinated clauses with or joined with nor. And also subordinate clauses are just mostly restricted to although, as though, so that, and while. And as I said before, the complete suppression of his favorite subordinator, which was whether, which he constantly used in his previous period. There also seem to be some potential changes in his personality, particularly the overuse of first-person singular possessive determiner my and the second-person singular pronoun you, right? There is an underuse and nearly a disappearance of first, second, and third-person plurals, and also third-person singular. So there seemed to be that his participant role in discourse is limited to just speaker and addressee. He is unable to put into the discourse or add into the discourse more people than just the addressee. So it's a very dual relationship here. There are also latent signs of spatial disorientation, and this is particularly evident in the overuse of adverbs and nouns of direction, right? There also seems to be a likely symptoms of memory loss and impairment due to the current manipulation of information, particularly in his working memory, which are related to the less usage of related independent clauses, not conjoined by the coordinated conjunction. Recall this has to do with the underuse of semicolon. The use of semicolon is a very, very, very common resort by Harold Wilson during the first years at office. He used it to bring together different ideas and to join together different ideas for his argumentations without using connectors, and this simply disappears. There's also an absence of colon. Colons are very much used in the first years of his office and nearly disappear towards the end. He used them particularly when he quoted the classics, and he was even able to quote literally what his opponents said in occasions. And also the underuse, as we already saw, about the variability of interrogative questions. So our hypothesis with all this data is that Harold Wilson might have been aware of his mild cognitive impairment, which was probably the reason for his retirement. Okay, and because he was aware, he might be using or might be started using some surrogate measures get rid of this, or to surpass this mild cognitive impairment. So he used part of his cognitive reserve as an attempt to cope with these cognitive dysfunctions. And these are particularly accessing more common and frequent words, hyponyms, and very frequent words. Also, the repetitive use of prefabricated chunks, we call the n-grams, particularly the very long n-grams, and also resulting to less complicated syntactic structures, lack of weather, lack of sentences which are joined without conjunctions, that is semicolon, and also Doric speech, okay? And well, there is some literature here, right? So very briefly, what I can say about corpus linguistics in medical and psychiatric research is that corpus-based techniques can be applied not just to syntax or what we normally do, but it's a very, very, very interesting and very challenging area to apply to medicine, psychiatry, and clinical linguistics. I think this is a very promising line. It would be great to have or to find synergy with clinical forensic linguists, neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, cognitive scientists, corpus, of course, and computation linguistics, and of course mathematicians and statisticians. So I really think that corpus linguistics might be very, very fruitfully contributed to a better understanding of language pathologies and language impairment. So thanks a million.